careful not to infect yourself when you're infecting others.
Well, Manny, you know, I was busy making a salad the other day, chopping some onions, and I ended up with a bloody finger. And I suspect I'm not the only one that's cut myself in the line of work. So I understand you have a story that's kind of related.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great lead into the story. So this particular one kind of caught my eye, and although after reading it, it was a little bit sort of clickbaitish. There is, I think, some lessons to be learned in here. So I'll give a quick overview of kind of what the story went into. But it basically is talking about a malware developer that's behind the Raccoon malware family. And this Raccoon malware family is basically it's an info stealing malware. And it's been around for a little over 2 years now. And it's actually gone by a couple of other names, Legion, Mohaza, Race Sealer, or Race Sealer, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And basically this is a MAS type malware, so a malware as a service. It uses a malware as a service model. This particular one is going for on the market today. It's one that you basically rent for about $75 a week or about $200 a month. So it's using that type of model. It's written in C++, and it basically it has the capability of stealing information off of a target from like over 60 different applications running on that host, and it steals it from your browser, from your crypto wallet, from email, from FTP clients, you name it. It's probably got a way to steal it off of your host. So in this particular case, the developer, in testing this, and whether it was inadvertent or not, and more than likely, I realize that the headline is that they infect themselves, but I think in this case they probably did it on purpose, but perhaps didn't really figure out what the full consequences are of, like, what is the machine that you're using right now to build the malware? What do you have running on that machine when you launch it and you let it loose? And what are the steps that the malware is going to take on your box, and what is it going to do as a consequence of that? So so obviously most malware that we deal with today has the whole concept of having a command and control, right? So it takes all the information, it usually bundles this information up, and then it's talking to some sort of command and control for either its instructions or some place to exfiltrate some information off of that box, right? So that's the typical model that you have here. And so as this developer was doing this, they, obviously it went and it did what it was supposed to do, which was to take all this information off the box and then ship it off to this command and control. Well, it turns out that this command and control, there are a lot of companies out there, and there's a particular company, I won't go into who that was, but there's a threat intel company that was monitoring the C2 infrastructure. And so there's a lot of companies out there today that do this type of monitoring, and they use it, they use that monitoring. It's great information for what's happening, like what is, what's changed in the malware, right? So they started to look at this. They're collecting all this information from the C2 server, and they're pulling back all these boxes that are talking to the C2 server. This particular one kind of piqued their interest because of an IP address that was being used, and they started to root around into what is this particular box. And once they did, they found a whole bunch of email addresses that were being used that looked like they were email addresses that had Raccoon or Raccoon Stealer as a domain. And so this Raccoon Stealer obviously is known to be the people behind the Raccoon malware. They also found a whole bunch of cookies that led to them to believe that when they took the cookies, they realized that it was cookies for a specific Russian-speaking forum, and then once they matched up the information from the information that they got from the box, they were able to match it up with a particular ID on that forum that is actually the Raccoon Stealer account on that particular forum. So everything kind of matches and lines up to, to say that this was probably the people behind it, and these credentials and all this information was being dumped into this area that this threat intel company was monitoring. So that's kind of the story behind it. But like when I read through this, I was thinking to myself, like, this is interesting that we don't see more stories like this, because when I think about this, I look at it and say, this probably happens a lot, and I'm wondering if we're not, and I know a lot of us here do this type of work, and we do look at, C2 infrastructure, and we do look at the infrastructure to see what kind of intelligence can we pull back from this infrastructure that'll help us to understand what the malware is doing, and then helps us to protect against it. But a lot of times there's so much there that you really can't pull back every single piece of information that you get from there, right? And so I think some of these boxes that may be, where the malware developer themselves infected themselves on mistake and sent this off, we never see it, right? It just goes by our radar. It's another box that got compromised, right? We're like, okay, right? It's another box. Why do I need to? It's just So my thinking here is that how do we do a better job of perhaps finding these one little needles in the haystack, where perhaps if you are able to dig into what that package is that just got delivered, perhaps that package gives you a little bit more information, because this package has all the secret ingredients for the malware itself. That makes sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. In fact, this is a little bit of a different perspective of this, but it reminded me of a situation. Any kind of tool needs to be tested in order for it to be assured that it works well. And you suggested that maybe this person did this on purpose and didn't realize the consequences. I can assure you that it's quite the opposite. When I cut myself with the knife while I was doing this, I knew the consequences and did not do it on purpose. But but more to the point, it actually reminds me of our first foray into actually doing internet analysis. And Stan, I think were in 5th grade at this time. But it actually goes back to the SQL Slammer worm, where we saw indications that SQL Slammer worm was launched and it attempted to propagate, but kind of died out. I think it perhaps infected a few machines, but then came back later, days later, and was actually quite successful in its propagation. Now, we were never able to really prove that, but there are other cases like that we've seen since then, of cases where, ultimately, and I kind of wonder how many times folks have been working on their ransomware and ended up ransomizing themselves, or weren't able to decrypt the stuff, and it propagated in their own little test networks, because ultimately, coding is something that requires to some extent some iterations to make sure it's working right, and it doesn't always work correctly the first time. So I can imagine that there are other cases like this, and and I think we've observed many times that sometimes controls are put into place. Just simple things like the keyboard type configuration can have be a protective measure that folks put into place to, I think, make sure that they're not infecting themselves, perhaps, and not those around them that might also be, perhaps direct competition as well.
Yes, this makes me think of some of the threat intel report, and actually the internet weather. I'm going to do a plug for the internet weather, because we use, like you said, Manny, we use similar techniques to kind of see where the adversaries make mistakes. It's true in the phishing story and some of the protections as well. It all comes together. It's like and this is what threat intelligence is really about, I think, cyber threat intelligence. Bad guys, as they do their thing, they're people just like the good guys, and they occasionally they mess up, They infect themselves with malware. They host their infrastructure the first time unencrypted. But, before they get to the encryption, there's almost, even if you think through, like an adversary's like growth in their ranking, they go through all these mistakes before they become elite. And so, like a good cyber threat intelligence program, if you're really worried about someone, you can actually trace back and find the adversary using all the little mistakes that they've made.